On the morning of June 3, 2025, a vessel called the Jaguar sat anchored off the coast of Kaliningrad, carrying roughly 700,000 barrels of Russian crude oil. Oil that, on paper, didn't exist. No Western insurer had touched it. No EU-licensed broker had arranged the deal. No G7 bank had cleared the transaction. The Jaguar was sailing under a flag of convenience, crewed by a rotating cast of contractors, owned through a shell company registered in the Marshall Islands, and financed through a correspondent bank in Dubai. It had been doing this route, Russian port to Asian buyer, via carefully chosen straits, for the better part of 18 months. That morning, the British government knew exactly where it was. What happened next wasn't an airstrike. It wasn't a naval interception. It was a letter, a legal designation, a name added to a sanctions list maintained by His Majesty's Treasury. Quiet, precise, bureaucratic, and potentially more disruptive to the Kremlin's war economy than anything that had happened in the preceding 12 months. But here's the part most coverage has missed entirely. The Jaguar wasn't the story. The Jaguar was the signal. Because what Britain announced that morning wasn't just one ship. It was a coordinated designation package targeting 110 vessels, tankers, support ships, and logistics intermediaries that together form the operational backbone of what analysts have come to call Russia's shadow fleet. And embedded inside that announcement were three legal mechanisms that, if they hold, don't just ground those 110 ships. They threaten to close the ports, dry up the insurance, and cut off the financial corridors that every one of those vessels depends on to keep moving, which raises the question that nobody in the mainstream is fully answering yet. Can a legal letter from London actually change the economics of a war? Hi, I'm Susan, and what we're going to break down today goes far beyond a shipping sanctions list. Because this moment, this specific package of designations and the legal architecture behind it represents something that hasn't been fully attempted since the early months of the Ukraine conflict. It is Britain making the argument that the shadow fleet isn't just a problem to manage, it's a vulnerability to exploit. In this video, we're going to cover three things. First, how Russia built the shadow fleet and why it worked so well for so long. Second, what Britain's new enforcement package actually does and what makes it different from the rounds of sanctions that came before it. And third, what this means for Russia's oil revenues, Ukraine's leverage, and the broader question of whether economic warfare can actually shift the trajectory of a military conflict that is ground on for more than 3 years. Because once you see the full architecture, who's financing these ships, which ports are processing them, and where the insurance corridors actually run, you start to understand that this isn't just about oil tankers. It's about whether the West still has the tools to make economic pressure hurt in ways that matter on the battlefield. If that kind of layered breakdown is what you come here for, the systems behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed. We're going to keep building on this story as it develops. To understand why Britain's move matters, you have to go back to February 24th, 2022. The day Russia invaded Ukraine at scale, the Western response came in two forms. The first was military, weapons, intelligence, training. The second was economic, the most extensive package of financial sanctions imposed on a major economy since the Second World War. And right at the center of that economic campaign was one specific pressure point: Russian oil. Russia, at the time, was generating somewhere between $700 million and $1 billion per day from oil and gas exports. That revenue was funding the war. Cut the revenue, the argument went, and you cut the war. It sounded logical. It was in many ways the right strategic instinct. And for about 6 months, it created genuine disruption. But Russia had been studying Western sanctions since at least 2014, when the first round of Crimea-related restrictions went into effect, and the Kremlin, along with a constellation of private intermediaries, had already begun building what would become the Shadow Fleet, a parallel maritime infrastructure designed specifically to route Russian oil to buyers who either couldn't or wouldn't comply with Western restrictions. Here's how it worked. When the G7 price cap went into effect in December 2022, capping the price at which Western-connected shipping, insurance, and finance could service Russian crude at $60 per barrel, Russia didn't comply. Instead, it accelerated a system it had already begun building. Aging tankers were acquired through shell companies in jurisdictions with minimal regulatory oversight. The Gabon flag registry, the Palau flag, the Cameroon flag, registries that exist largely as administrative functions and have limited capacity to enforce international maritime law. These ships were insured through a parallel ecosystem of providers, primarily in India, the UAE, and Turkey, that had no formal connection to Lloyd's of London or the P&I clubs that dominate Western maritime insurance. And the financial transactions underlying each voyage were routed through correspondent banking relationships in jurisdictions where dollar clearing doesn't require U.S. Federal Reserve oversight. The result, by mid-2023, was a functioning parallel economy. Russian crude was flowing to India at volumes that had, in some months, exceeded 2 million barrels per day. It was flowing to China, it was flowing to Turkey, where some of it was refined and then re-exported to European markets that had nominally banned Russian oil. And the G7 price cap, the mechanism supposed to limit Russia's per-barrel revenue, was being systematically violated. By early 2024, Russian Urals crude was trading consistently above $70 per barrel, with some cargoes clearing above $80 when routed through the right intermediaries. The cap was holding on paper. In reality, Russia was making more from oil than many analysts had projected when the restrictions went live. And that's when the calculation changed. So what did Western governments do about it? They added more ships to sanctions lists. They issued warnings to intermediary ports. They published advisories to flag registries. And to be fair, some of those measures had effects. Certain registries tightened their oversight. Certain ports became more cautious about processing shadow fleet cargoes. But the fundamental architecture of the fleet remained intact, because the original sanctions approach had a structural problem. It was designed to deny Russia access to Western maritime infrastructure. It was not designed to close the non-Western maritime infrastructure that Russia had built in the interim. There's a difference between those two things, and it's not subtle. On paper, the G7 sanctions look comprehensive. In reality, they were creating a floor, a Western ecosystem from which Russia was excluded, while leaving a ceiling that Russia could build up to. The shadow fleet wasn't a violation of the sanctions regime. It was an architectural response to it. Russia didn't find a loophole. Russia built a parallel room. Which brings us to what Britain announced in June 2025, and why it's structurally different from what came before. The 110-vessel designation package that His Majesty's Treasury published wasn't primarily about denying those ships access to UK ports or UK-connected services, though it does that too. The more significant element was what it did to the secondary infrastructure. Specifically, the announcement included legal designations targeting 3 UAE-based ship management companies, 2 Turkish insurance intermediaries, and a network of 7 shell entities registered across the Marshall Islands and Gabon that had been identified as the primary ownership vehicles for 43 of the flagged tankers. And here's where it gets more complicated and more consequential. Under UK sanctions law, secondary sanctions exposure doesn't require a UK nexus in the same way US Treasury designations traditionally have. What the British package did was designate those shell entities in a way that triggers correspondent banking restrictions across the approximately 47 countries that have adopted parallel recognition agreements with His Majesty's Treasury under the post-Brexit sanctions architecture. That's not just the UK acting alone. That's a legal mechanism that extends British designation power into the banking systems of countries that might not have otherwise applied it. The response, or rather the absence of one, from the Kremlin in the 48 hours following the announcement is where the story really begins. No official denial, no counterstatement, no immediate diplomatic protest. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued a boilerplate condemnation of unlawful Western pressure on legitimate commercial shipping, but they didn't dispute the specifics. They didn't contest the ownership chain. They didn't claim the named vessels were operating legally. That response, such as it was, is itself a data point. If you're finding this breakdown useful, if understanding the mechanics behind the sanctions war matters to you, take a moment to support the video with a like. These deeper dives take significant research, and your engagement helps more people find analysis that goes beyond the headline. There's a specific number that makes the stakes concrete here. According to estimates from the Kiev School of Economics, which has been tracking shadow fleet operations since 2022, the 110 vessels designated in the British package collectively transported approximately 1.4 billion barrels of Russian crude in the preceding 18 months. At an average clearing price of $72 per barrel, which is a conservative estimate for the period, that represents roughly $100 billion in oil revenues that flowed through this specific network, not Russia's entire oil export economy, but a meaningful slice of it. And those are the ships that now face the prospect of port denial, insurance cancellation, and banking system exclusion in a significantly wider geographic footprint than previous designation rounds had managed to achieve. Now zoom out. Because the shadow fleet story doesn't exist in isolation. It connects to something larger, a structural question about what economic warfare can actually accomplish when the target has had 3 years to adapt, to route around, and to build alternative financial architecture. The pattern here mirrors something we've seen before. When the United States sanctioned Iran's oil sector aggressively in 2018, Iran didn't stop exporting oil. It built a shadow fleet. When Venezuela faced comprehensive oil sanctions in 2019, it didn't collapse. It adapted, routed through intermediaries, and found buyers willing to absorb the risk discount. The The same logic has now been applied by Russia at a scale that dwarfs both of those prior cases. Russia's shadow fleet is estimated at somewhere between 600 and 700 vessels today, depending on how you define the network. Britain just designated 110 of them. That's real, but it's also roughly 15 to 18% of the total estimated fleet. And this is where Britain's move becomes even more significant, because the logic isn't that designating 110 ships ends the shadow fleet. The logic is that it targets the specific vessels that are operationally central to the network, that it uses a legal mechanism with wider geographic reach than previous rounds, and that it creates a replication threat. Every ship operating in this space now has to calculate not just whether it's currently designated, but whether the route it's running, the management company behind it, and the shell entity above it are going to be on the next list. That uncertainty has value. Here's the part that almost nobody's covering in full context. Britain's designation package came 4 days after a classified briefing between UK Treasury officials and their counterparts in Brussels, Washington, and Ottawa. That briefing, according to multiple officials familiar with the discussions, was specifically about coordinating the secondary banking restrictions, ensuring that the correspondent banking exclusions Britain was triggering would be applied consistently across allied financial systems, rather than allowing London-designated entities to simply shift their dollar-clearing relationships to Frankfurt or Paris. The EU hasn't published its own matching designation round yet as of this recording, but the coordination architecture suggests that what Britain published is intended to be the first move in a sequenced package, not a standalone action. This is not random. This is sequenced. And what that sequence represents at the strategic level is an attempt to close the ceiling, not just reinforce the floor. Previous sanctions architecture kept Russia out of Western maritime infrastructure. This round is attempting to make the alternative infrastructure economically unstable, not by destroying it, by making it expensive enough, uncertain enough, and legally exposed enough that the per-barrel cost of routing Russian crude through the shadow fleet rises to a point where Russia's effective oil revenue falls meaningfully, even if the physical barrels are still moving. The same structural logic appeared in the semiconductor sanctions against China's advanced chip sector in 2023. The goal wasn't to stop every chip from reaching Chinese manufacturers. The goal was to raise the cost, the complexity, and the risk premium on every transaction to a level that slowed development timelines and increased the capital intensity of workarounds. Whether it worked is still being debated, but the mechanism is the same. Not a wall, but a friction tax. Russia is now facing a maritime friction tax, and the question is how high that tax gets before it starts showing up in Kremlin budget numbers. This doesn't stay abstract for long. The most direct transmission mechanism is straightforward. If shadow fleet insurance costs rise, because the intermediaries providing that insurance are now facing designation exposure in a wider set of banking jurisdictions, the per-barrel cost of exporting Russian crude increases. That cost gets passed somewhere. Sometimes Russia absorbs it through a lower net realization per barrel. Sometimes it gets shared with buyers who accept a wider discount in exchange for taking on more logistical risk. Either way, Russia's effective oil revenue per barrel declines. The IMF's baseline estimate for Russia's 2025 federal budget assumes an average Urals crude price of around $65 per barrel. Russia's current break-even price for its wartime budget, accounting for defense spending that has risen to approximately 6.7% of GDP, is estimated between $70 and $75 per barrel. That's a narrow margin, and it's a margin that gets squeezed, not all at once, but progressively, as the friction costs of routing through a more legally exposed shadow fleet accumulate. For ordinary people connected to this story, the transmission runs in a few directions. If you're in Europe and you've been following energy prices over the past 2 years, you know that Russian crude, even sanctioned Russian crude refined in Turkey or India, has been finding its way into European markets through processing pathways that the current restrictions don't cleanly block. A tightening of the shadow fleet increases the cost of those flows, which filters through into refined product pricing, which eventually shows up on fuel and heating bills. The effect is modest in the near term, but it compounds. These consequences don't announce themselves. They show up in what you pay to fill your tank or heat your home next winter. There are 3 realistic paths forward from here. The first is that the designation package lands as intended. The coordinated secondary banking restrictions take effect across allied jurisdictions, insurance costs for shadow fleet operators rise sharply, and Russia begins facing a meaningful revenue squeeze within 6 to 12 months. That's the optimistic scenario, and it requires a level of allied coordination that has been inconsistent in previous sanction rounds. The second path is partial effectiveness. The designation package disrupts the specific 110 vessels and their management networks. Russia accelerates its diversification into even more opaque ownership structures and flag registries, and the net effect is a 6 to 9 month disruption before the fleet reconstitutes. This has been the historical pattern for most shadow fleet enforcement actions. Not failure exactly, but not decisive either. The third path is the one nobody wants to say out loud. The designation package triggers a meaningful diplomatic response from India or China, the two largest buyers of shadow fleet crude, in the form of financial countermeasures that reduce the effective reach of the secondary banking restrictions. India, in particular, has been explicit in its resistance to secondary sanction pressure. If New Delhi signals that it will not apply the correspondent banking exclusions Britain is triggering, the geographic footprint of the package contracts significantly. If you want to track which of those paths this takes and what it means for the next phase of the Ukraine economic war, make sure you're subscribed. The next development in this sequence is likely to come from Brussels, and when it does, we'll break it down the same way. So we come back to the question the Jaguar raised on that June morning, sitting off Kaliningrad with 700,000 barrels of oil that, on paper, didn't exist. Can a legal letter from London actually change the economics of a war? The answer, and this is the honest version, is not alone, not immediately, and not without a level of coordination that the Allied sanctions architecture has, until now, struggled to sustain over time. What previous rounds demonstrated is that Russia is adaptive, that the intermediary ecosystem it built is resilient, and that the countries willing to absorb shadow fleet risk at a discount aren't going away. But here's what's different this time, and why this moment carries more weight than the previous designation rounds did. Britain's package is targeting the management layer, not just the ships. It's using a legal mechanism with wider correspondent banking reach than previous rounds had available. And it appears to be the first move in a coordinated Allied sequence rather than a unilateral action. Those are structural differences, not cosmetic ones. The question now is whether the coordination holds, whether the EU follows through on its matching package, whether the secondary banking restrictions actually propagate through the 47 aligned jurisdictions or get quietly carved out through diplomatic pressure from major buyers, and whether Russia, which has had 3 years to build alternative infrastructure, has built enough of it to absorb the friction tax Britain just imposed. Because if the coordination holds and the restrictions propagate and the friction tax rises, then what Britain did on June 3rd wasn't just a sanctions update. It was the first serious attempt to close the ceiling on the shadow fleet rather than just reinforce the floor. And if it doesn't, if the coordination fractures and the designated ships reconstitute under new flag registries within 9 months, then the story that gets written isn't about British sanctions effectiveness. It's about whether the West still has the economic tools to meaningfully constrain a major power that has spent 3 years specifically studying how to route around them. The next phase is already taking shape, and which version of this story we're telling in 12 months will say something significant, not just about Russia's war economy, but about whether economic warfare still works the way the people deploying it believe it does.